She was the kind of woman people looked through, not at. That was exactly how Wren Calloway had survived 4 years working the books for Meridian Logistics. A shell company so clean on paper it practically gleamed, and so rotten underneath that the men who ran it wore their suits like armor. She kept her head down. She dressed in dark colors. She ate lunch at her desk. She did not ask questions about the discrepancies she found in the freight invoices, the ones where $3 million moved between accounts labeled equipment maintenance and somehow arrived weeks later in a numbered account in the Caymans with no corresponding paperwork. She noted them. She filed them. She said nothing. Wren was good at saying nothing. It was a skill she'd developed early, the particular invisibility of a woman who didn't fit the shape the world had decided women should be. She was soft where fashion magazines said to be angular, round where the world said to be sharp, and she had learned, by the time she was 22, that the easiest way to move through a room unnoticed was to give people nothing to notice. No bright colors, no loud laugh, no opinions delivered unprompted, just the quiet competence of a woman who showed up, did the work better than anyone else in the building, and then went home to her cat. The cat's name was Admiral, and he was the only living creature in Chicago who knew how good she actually was at her job. The Meridian offices occupied the 14th floor of a glass tower on West Wacker Drive, with a view of the river that cost more per square foot than Wren's entire apartment. She arrived every morning at 7:45, 15 minutes before anyone else, brewed a single cup of coffee from the machine in the break room, and sat down at her desk with the focused quiet of someone who had made peace with being underestimated. She had not made peace with it. She had simply stopped arguing. It was a Thursday in March when everything changed. The day started normally. Wren logged into the accounting system, pulled the previous month's freight manifests, and began cross-referencing them against the wire transfers that had come through overnight. She found the usual irregularities, a $40,000 discrepancy between what was invoiced and what was deposited, a vendor code that didn't exist in any database she had access to, a timestamp that placed a shipment in Detroit and Miami simultaneously. She documented everything in a separate encrypted file. She kept on a thumb drive she wore around her neck, tucked under her collar, because she was not stupid enough to store it on the company server. She had been keeping that file for 11 months. She wasn't sure what she planned to do with it. She wasn't sure she planned to do anything. But something in her, the same part that had caught her first employer embezzling from a non-profit when she was 24, the same part that had quietly handed that information to the FBI before resigning, that part of her could not look at a number and pretend it was something other than what it was. Numbers didn't lie. People did. Numbers just told you what people were trying to hide. She was so absorbed in the manifests that she didn't hear the elevator open at 8:43 in the morning. She didn't hear the footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crossing the marble reception area. She didn't hear the low exchange of voices near the front desk, where young Kira from reception said something nervous and high-pitched and then went very quiet. What she heard was the door to the accounting department opening. She looked up. There were 2 of them, large men in dark coats, the kind of men who took up space in a way that had nothing to do with their physical size. They had the flat, watchful eyes of people who had seen the worst of what other people were capable of and had simply stopped being surprised by it. "Wren Calloway," the taller one said. "That's me," she said carefully. "Mr. Ashford wants to see you." Her stomach turned to ice. Stephen Ashford. She had never met him in person. She had seen his signature on documents, had processed his accounts, had watched several $1 million move in and out of structures that bore his name. She knew, in the way you knew things you were never supposed to know, that Stephen Ashford was not a logistics executive. Stephen Ashford was the reason the men on this floor wore Italian suits and spoke on burner phones and occasionally disappeared for 3-day stretches without explanation. Stephen Ashford was the reason Meridian Logistics existed at all. "Of course," she said. She closed her laptop. She stood. She did not let them see her hands shake. The executive floor was not something the accounting department visited. There were no interdepartmental meetings, no casual drop-ins, no reason for anyone below the 12th floor to ever find themselves in the private elevator that required a key fob she'd never been issued. She rode up between the two men in silence, watching the numbers climb, aware with horrible clarity that she had no idea what she'd done wrong. The office was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the Chicago River, slate-gray and restless in the March wind. The furniture was dark leather and pale wood, spare in the way that expensive things often were. There was a desk at the far end, heavy, antique, the kind of desk that had belonged to someone important before it belonged to him. He was standing at the window. Stephen Ashford was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she'd expected. Something louder, perhaps, something that wore its power more obviously. What she saw instead was a man in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, dark-haired going silver at the temples, wearing a charcoal suit that had clearly been made for him specifically, and no one else. He had the face of someone who had not smiled spontaneously in a long time. Not cold, exactly, contained, like a door that had been locked from the inside. He turned when she entered. She watched his eyes move over her the way everyone's eyes moved over her. A brief, automatic assessment, filing her away under a category, and then something changed. His gaze sharpened, settled. He looked at her the way people looked at problems they found interesting. "Mrs. Calloway," he said. His voice was low, measured. "Sit down." She sat. He remained standing, which she understood was deliberate. He crossed to the desk but didn't sit behind it. He stood at the corner, looking at her, and she had the uncomfortable sensation of being a number he was trying to reconcile. "You've been with Meridian for 4 years," he said. "Yes, your performance reviews are exceptional. Your error rate is essentially 0. He paused. "You've also been accessing freight manifests you have no authorization to review." The ice in her stomach crystallized. The manifests are routed through the same accounting pipeline as the... "I know where they're routed." His eyes hadn't moved from her face. "What I want to know is what you've done with what you found." The thumb drive under her collar felt suddenly very heavy. She met his gaze. "I don't know what you're referring to." The silence stretched. He let it. She understood that this was a technique, the deliberate patience of someone who knew that most people would filter silence with incriminating confessions, and she refused to fill it. She held his gaze and said nothing, and waited. Something shifted in his expression. Almost imperceptible. Almost. "You're not afraid of me," he said. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." He studied her for another moment. Then, "What's your salary, Miss Calloway?" The question was so unexpected that she blinked. $62,000 a year. As of Monday, it's 140. He moved around the desk and sat down, opening a folder. "You're being reassigned to the Executive Financial Division. You'll report directly to me. Your predecessor left somewhat abruptly and took a great deal of institutional knowledge with him." His tone on the word "left" suggested that departing had not been entirely the predecessor's idea. "You have 10 days to get up to speed." She stared at him. You're offering me a promotion. I'm reassigning you to a role that requires someone who can find anomalies in complex financial structures and keep what they find entirely to herself." He looked at her over the folder. "Based on the last 4 years, you appear to be qualified on both counts." She thought about the thumb drive under her collar. She thought about the encrypted file with 11 months of documented irregularities. She thought about the FBI agent, whose card she still had in a drawer at home, whose number she had never called. "Why me?" she asked. His expression didn't change. "Because you're the only person in this building who found the problem, and didn't immediately run to someone to use it as leverage. He set the folder down. That tells me you're smart enough to understand what you're dealing with, and careful enough to stay alive doing it. She accepted the job. She told herself it was because she needed the money, because her student loans still had 11 years left on them, because Admiral needed a specific veterinary prescription that cost $400 a month. She told herself it was practical. It was, but it was also because Stephen Ashford had looked at her, actually looked at her, not through her, and seen exactly what she was. She was not accustomed to being seen. The next 6 weeks were the most intellectually demanding of her professional life. The financial architecture of Ashford's operation was extraordinary. A nested series of legitimate businesses, shell companies, investment vehicles, and charitable foundations that moved money with the elegant complexity of a watch mechanism. She spent 12 hours a day learning it. She took notes in a personal shorthand no one else could read. She asked precise questions and received precise answers, and slowly, steadily, began to understand the shape of the machine she had walked into. She also began to understand Stephen Ashford. He was not what the fear that surrounded him suggested. He was not arbitrary or theatrical in his violence, the way she had half expected. He was deliberate, and the deliberateness was somehow more frightening, because it meant there was always a reason. He ran his operation the way she ran her spreadsheets, with absolute attention to accuracy and a total intolerance for error. Men who made mistakes disappeared. Men who were loyal and competent were rewarded beyond anything a legitimate corporation would offer. He was also, she discovered to her considerable discomfort, deeply perceptive. He noticed things, small things. The way she stayed an extra hour on the nights before a major audit, not because she'd been asked to, but because the numbers weren't perfectly balanced, and she couldn't leave until they were. The way she rearranged the filing system in her new office without asking permission, because the previous system was inefficient. And 2 days later, he walked in and stood looking at it for a long moment without saying anything, and she braced herself, and he said only. Took me 6 months to convince my last CFO to do that. He noticed that she drank her coffee black and had it on her desk before his assistant arrived each morning. He noticed that she worked through lunch on the 3rd Thursday of every month, when the interbank transfers required simultaneous reconciliation across 4 time zones. And one Thursday in April, she found a sandwich on her desk from the place 2 blocks away that she'd mentioned once, in passing, as her favorite. No note. Just the sandwich. She ate it and pretended her chest didn't ache a little. She knew what she was doing. She recognized it with the uncomfortable clarity she brought to everything. The way she looked forward to the morning briefings, the way her pulse did something stupid when he said her name. She catalogued it and filed it and told herself firmly that it was irrelevant. Men like Stephen Ashford did not look at women like Wren Calloway in ways that mattered. She was useful to him. That was the whole of it. She was wrong. She just didn't know it yet. It was a Wednesday in early May when 2 men she didn't recognize were waiting in the parking garage when she left the building at 7:30 in the evening. She knew immediately that something was wrong. It was the way they didn't look at their phones, didn't pretend to be waiting for a car. They simply stood, watching the elevator doors, with the stillness of people who had been sent to wait for a specific thing. She stepped back. Her hand went to her phone. She didn't get to use it. The taller one was fast. Faster than a man his size had any right to be, and the arm that came around her waist hauled her backward before she could scream, and something sharp pressed against her neck, and the garage lights went out. She woke up in a warehouse. Her head was pounding with the specific, nauseating quality of someone who had been drugged, rather than hit, and it took her 3 slow breaths to assess her situation without giving away that she was conscious. Her wrists were bound behind the chair she was in. Zip ties, not rope, tighter than necessary. cutting into the soft skin of her wrists. Her phone was gone. Her bag was gone. The thumb drive was still around her neck, tucked under her collar, which either meant they hadn't found it, or they didn't know what they were looking for. The warehouse smelled like salt water and rust. Through the gaps in the high industrial windows, she could see the orange-gray of a Chicago night sky. She could hear water. The lake, she thought, or the river. She was somewhere near the waterfront. There were 4 men. She counted them without turning her head, using the peripheral vision she had spent years training herself to maximize in environments where looking directly at people drew unwanted attention. 2 near the door, 1 by the far wall on a phone call. 1, the one in charge, she judged, from the way the others deferred. Standing 20 feet away watching her, he was watching her wake up. "She's awake," he said, presumably to the man on the phone. The man on the phone looked over. His face was not unkind, which was somehow more frightening than cruelty. "Good. Tell Ashford we have her." Her blood went cold. This was not a random crime. This was a message. The man in charge crossed the warehouse and crouched in front of her. He had the look of someone who was accustomed to frightening people and was mildly puzzled that she wasn't visibly more frightened. "You're the accountant." "I'm an accountant," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. "You've been working directly for Ashford for 6 weeks. He tilted his head. "Word is you're the one who restructured his offshore accounts last month. You know where the money is." "I know where Meridian Logistics' operating capital is," she said carefully. "That's my job." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "Let me be more specific. Ashford moved $40 million through a charitable foundation in February. We want to know where it went." She looked at him. She thought about the February transfer. She did know about it, had in fact processed part of the documentation for it, had been meticulous about the legal filings. And she weighed, in the space of 3 seconds, what she knew and what he thought she knew and what she could actually survive telling him. "I'd need access to the files," she said. It bought her 45 minutes. She didn't know what was happening on the other end of whatever communication was going on. But she knew how to take her time. She asked clarifying questions. She said she needed to think. She said the foundation transfers involved a layered structure that she'd have to walk through carefully. She was not stalling out of hope. She was stalling because it was the only thing she could do. But in the back of her mind, in the very quiet place where she kept the things she was not allowed to want, she thought about Stephen Ashford and the way he had looked at her across the desk on her first day and said, "You're careful enough to stay alive." She was trying very hard to stay alive. It was the sound that told her something had changed. A shift in air pressure, a distant clatter that didn't belong to the natural rhythms of the warehouse. And then 2 things happened so quickly that she only reconstructed the sequence afterward. One of the men near the door shouted, and all the lights went out. What followed was not chaos. That was the thing that struck her later, when she had the distance to think about it. From her vantage point, blind in the sudden dark, what she heard was not panic. It was the controlled, methodical sound of people who knew exactly what they were doing and had no particular feelings about any of it. Footsteps, impact sounds, the specific thud of a body hitting concrete with no intention of getting up, then a light, a thin tactical beam, sweeping, then silence, then a voice she knew. Ren. Not a question, not a shout, just her name, said the way you said the name of something you had been looking for. He crossed the warehouse in the torchlight, and she could see his face, that controlled, contained face she had spent 6 weeks learning to read. And something was wrong with it. The containment was still there, but there were fault lines running through it, hairline fractures that she had never seen before. He looked like a man who had driven very fast, and was only now allowing himself to consider why. He dropped to one knee in front of her chair, and his hands went to her wrists, and she heard the snap of the zip ties cutting, and his breath came out in a long, slow exhale that was almost not controlled. "You're hurt," he said. Flat, factual. The way he said everything. The zip ties. Her wrists were bleeding slightly where the plastic had cut in. "It's not serious. Your face." His hand came up, and she went still, and his fingers touched the side of her jaw, carefully, like she was something breakable, where she hadn't even realized until that moment that she'd been struck. The skin was tender. She'd been unconscious when it happened. She watched his jaw tighten. "I'm okay," she said. "You're not," he said, "but you will be." He got her out of the chair. He had a coat with him. She didn't ask where it had come from, and he put it around her shoulders, and it smelled like him. And she told herself firmly that the fact that she pressed her face into the collar for 1/2 second while he was looking away was simply a stress response, and not evidence of anything meaningful. The drive back was in a black SUV, with a driver who said nothing, and a back seat that felt very small. She sat with his coat still around her shoulders and her hands in her lap, and watched the city lights come back as they left the waterfront behind. "It was Carver," he said, after several minutes. "Dennis Carver. He runs distribution for one of the Detroit families. He's been watching my operation for 2 months. The 40 million he asked about," she said. "You didn't tell him." "I didn't tell him." He was quiet for a moment. "You know where it went?" "Of course I do. I filed the documentation." She looked at her hands. "It went to 3 children's hospitals in Cook County and a scholarship fund at UIC. All legitimate, all properly filed with the IRS." She paused. "It also happens to be the best tax structure you could have chosen for the Q2 liability position, so efficient." Another silence. She could feel him looking at her. "You cross-referenced the tax implications," he said. "I cross-reference everything. It's my job." "It's not your job. Then it's my compulsion." She finally looked at him. "I'm a numbers person, Stefan. I found an inefficiency. I fixed it." It was the first time she had used his first name. She hadn't planned to. The drugs were probably still metabolizing. She looked away. He didn't say anything, but she was aware, with the hypervigilance of someone whose nervous system had spent the last several hours in survival mode, that the quality of the silence in the car had changed. His building was in River North, a converted industrial tower with security that was not subtle about what it was securing. She had never been there before. She thought about protesting. She had her own apartment. Admiral was waiting. She was fine. And she looked at Stefan Ashford's face and understood that protesting was not going to be productive. The apartment was what she would have predicted. Vast, sparsely furnished, dark materials, expensive and impersonal. The kind of space that said its occupant didn't live here so much as conduct operations from it. He led her to the bathroom off the guest room and produced, from under the sink, a first aid kit that was absurdly comprehensive. "Sit," he said, nodding at the edge of the tub. She sat. He cleaned the cuts on her wrists with a focus that she recognized from the way he approached problems at work. Total, methodical attention. No wasted motion. He didn't speak. His hands were careful. When he got to the bruise along her jaw, his touch went lighter still, and she watched his face and saw the fault lines again, deeper now. "You should have told me," he said. Low. Not angry. Something under angry, which was worse. "Told you what?" "That something felt wrong. In the garage. Before. If you had called, it happened fast." "I know." He was still looking at the bruise. "It should not have happened at all. It's a dangerous business," she said. "You told me that when you gave me the job. I told you it was complicated." He finally looked at her face, not the bruise on it, but her eyes. "I didn't tell you I would let someone put their hands on you." She didn't know what to say to that. She was not accustomed to not knowing what to say. She was saved from saying anything at all by the fact that her composure, which had held with extraordinary discipline, through zip ties and darkness, and 45 minutes of stalling, and a car ride and a bruise being touched with more gentleness than she had expected from anyone, chose that moment to quietly come apart. She didn't cry. She wasn't a crier. But her hands, which had been perfectly still in her lap, started shaking, and she looked at them with something like irritation, and he saw it. He sat down on the edge of the tub beside her, not touching her. Just close. You did well, he said. In there. You kept them talking. You didn't panic. I was panicking, she said. I was panicking very efficiently. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. She pressed her lips together. I kept thinking about the number, she said, which made no sense out of context, but she didn't know how else to explain the thought that had been running beneath the fear for the entire 45 minutes she'd spent stalling. The 40 million, I kept thinking. They have the wrong information. They think there's something hidden, but the whole point is, there's nothing hidden. It's all clean. It's all documented. And they were never going to find what they were looking for because it doesn't exist. She paused. That's what I kept holding on to. The number was clean. The work was right. Whatever happened, the work was right. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. What? She said. Nothing. He was quiet for a moment. I've had 12 people in that role in the last 9 years. You're the first one who, in the middle of a kidnapping, was primarily concerned with the accuracy of your filing. I was also concerned about not dying, she said. I'm sure. The almost law was there again, brief and warm and completely at odds with his face. But the filing came first. The filing is always first, she said. Numbers don't change. Everything else does. He studied her for a long moment. She had the feeling she was being assessed against some internal calculation she didn't have access to, that familiar sensation of being weighed. But this time it felt different. This time it didn't feel like categorization. It felt like recognition. I noticed you, he said. She blinked. Before the reassignment, before the review of your access logs. He wasn't looking away. I noticed you 11 months before that. The air in the bathroom shifted. The reorganization of the freight manifest system, he said. You flagged an indexing error that had been in the pipeline for 3 years. The error added 11 hours to every compliance audit cycle. You flagged it in an internal memo addressed to no one in particular because you weren't sure who to send it to. A pause. I read it. I fixed the index, I never told you. 11 months, that was how long her thumb drive had been filling up. 11 months of documented irregularities, carefully saved because she didn't know what else to do with what she saw. 11 months of Stefan Ashford watching her not do anything about it. You were testing me, she said. I was watching you. His voice was even. There's a difference. A test implies a predetermined outcome. I didn't know what you were going to do. I wanted to see what you'd choose. He paused. You chose to document and wait. I've had 3 people in the last decade find what you found. 2 of them ran immediately to use it. 1 of them disappeared. His voice gave nothing away on the word disappeared. You sat on it for 11 months and kept your head down and kept the work clean and didn't make a move in any direction. I didn't know what the right move was, she said honestly. That's what made you interesting. He tilted his head slightly. Most people think knowing the right answer makes them interesting. You're interesting because you refuse to act until you're certain, and when you're not certain, you wait. She looked at him. That must be very inconvenient for you. Occasionally, he said. It's also the reason you're still alive. She didn't know when she had started being aware of the smallness of the bathroom, the close air of it, the fact that they were both sitting on the edge of the same bathtub in a way that was objectively absurd, given who they each were. She was aware of it now. She was aware of his shoulder, approximately 8 inches from hers, and the way he was looking at her with that expression, she still couldn't fully classify. Why did you tell me that? She asked. Because you almost didn't come back tonight, he said. Simple, direct, the way he said everything that mattered. And I would like you to understand that if something had happened to you, the loss would not have been professional. She absorbed that. That's a very indirect way of saying something, she said. I'm a private person. You run a criminal empire. Those things aren't mutually exclusive. She looked at her hands. The shaking had stopped. I have a cat, she said, which was not what she'd meant to say, but was the first thing that came out. His name is Admiral. He needs to be fed. He considered this with perfect seriousness. I'll have someone bring him here. You cannot send your men to retrieve my cat. Ren, he bites strangers. Then I'll go myself. She stared at him. You're not going to my apartment to get my cat. I'm not sending anyone else. He stood, retrieving his jacket from the hook behind the door. Give me your address. She looked at him for a long moment. At this man who moved through the world like a sealed door, who had crossed a waterfront warehouse in the dark because her name had been said on the wrong kind of phone call, who had sat on the edge of a bathtub and cleaned her wrists with hands that didn't shake and told her, in the most controlled possible way, that she mattered. And she thought about all the ways she had made herself invisible, all the years of dark colors and eating at her desk, and telling herself she was fine with being looked through. He was not looking through her. He was looking at her with the focused, absolute attention he brought to things that mattered to him. 4217 North Clark, she said. The spare key is under the blue pot by the door. He eats at 8. He nodded. At the door, he paused. There's a room here, he said, without turning around, for as long as you need it, until this is resolved. She thought about her apartment, small and familiar, with Admiral's water bowl by the kitchen sink and the thumb drive she could now probably stop wearing around her neck. I'll stay, she said. For now. He walked out. She heard the quiet sounds of the apartment rearranging itself around his presence, the low voice on a phone call, the controlled efficiency of a man putting things in order. She looked at her wrists, cleaned, bandaged, no longer shaking. She thought about numbers, the way they told you what was really true when everything else was obscured. The way a clean set of books was a kind of honesty, a refusal to fudge the edges and call the rounding error acceptable. She had spent 4 years being invisible and calling it survival. Stefan Ashford had spent 11 months watching her from a distance and waiting to see what she would do. They had both, she thought, been running their own kind of parallel calculation, and tonight, in a warehouse by the waterfront, where the numbers had not been the problem at all, the calculation had finally resolved. She heard the front door open and close. She heard, a moment later, the sound of an elevator descending. He was going to get her cat. Ren Calloway sat on the edge of someone else's bathtub in a borrowed coat, in a building full of dangerous men, with clean hands and a clear conscience, and a filing system that was, as always, perfectly organized. She allowed herself, just for a moment, to smile.